Look, great to be with you all today and talking about navigating the energy challenge. I noticed 3 minutes has been chopped off our time. I was going to ask about your favourite energy movie, but what I thought instead was I'd ask about the much talked about Alinta Energy Australia merger, just to throw that in the mix. Jeff, you've just got back from an overseas trip. Do you want to give us an update on the merger? Are the talks on with your colleague Mark?
No comment, Perry. Happy to talk to you about the energy industry and where we're at on transition, but no, I'm not going to make any public comments today about the sale of our business.
Mark, what about you? I mean, 3.5 million customers, a combined company. Could that work well?
I'm very boring and say what you'd expect me to say, that we don't comment on market speculation. I guess more broadly, I would describe the energy industry at the moment a bit like the one of the good old Moe B&S balls, the Bachelor and Spinster balls, where there's an awful lot of transaction going on, a lot of people working about what their future is going to be. We saw Edify being bought by the old CDPQ team like Cass last night, and there's a lot of activity in the sector. So we're, I suspect, as a sector, going to keep you busy, Perry.
Should a deal eventuate down the track, do you imagine ACCC might be a hurdle there?
I'm not going to comment on any market speculation, Perry.
Okay, all right. Let's get to one of our favourite topics, coal. So I want to look a little bit just at where we're at. Obviously, the Premier just made some interesting comments around Eraring in particular. I might just start with you, Richard. You operate the Vales Point coal station, which is due to close, I think, in 2033. How are you seeing the market at the moment, and might we need further extensions?
I think if you actually look at the transition, I'm not a politician, so I have the ability to be wrong. When I ever look at these problems, I go, what happens if I am wrong? So we heard Daniel Westman talk earlier about everything that's going to get built and therefore coal is going to go. I just ask yes, what if that doesn't occur? What's wrong? So when I look at Vales, I look at the life of that asset and say, if that doesn't occur, what can we do with Vales? And I think one of the problems we've had in the industry, if you look at why coal is not particularly reliable at the moment, everyone say, oh, they're old, they're getting old. I'm getting old, I'm not particularly reliable. But with coal-fired power stations, you need to maintain them. So if you keep on promising that they have to go, and they're going to go, it's very hard to make the investment decisions in reliability. I think that's changed. So I think what we're seeing now is a stage with the coal assets, yes, they are particularly unreliable because over the past 10 years, we had this constant message, they're going to shut, they're going to shut, they're going to shut now, and the reliability has been cut. So I think the onus is on owners like ourselves to actually look at that and say, okay, the transition is occurring. We're not trying to stop it, but we need to make sure power stays affordable and reliable, and therefore we need to invest appropriately in those power stations such that if something does go wrong with the transition, and I'm not saying it is, but if something does go wrong, when we talk about 2033, okay, I could go to 35, perhaps I could go to 36. The closure dates on these power stations is not fixed. It's not a scientific number. They will close when the market says we don't need them, and we won't need them when we've built the replacement. So how long does that take? And that will dictate when we close. And we've got to keep them reliable in the meantime.
Well, Mark, I wanted to ask about your lawn. I guess that's next cab off the rank, due to close in 2028. Obviously, a few issues, as we speak with your lawn. But how are you thinking about that? I mean, as we've heard today, Victoria's energy transition, its renewable goals are off the pace. How does that influence how you're thinking about your lawn?
We own and operate two coal-fired power stations, and they're a good example of a contrast. We've got your lawn, which is about 50 years old. It's brown coal. It was built on a smaller scale, so it's 350 to 360 megawatt units. And we've got Mount Piper here in New South Wales, which is 700 megawatt units, and it's just a more modern technology. And something like Mount Piper, we can get down to 150 megawatts, up to 700, a lot of operating range. So when you talk about a more renewable system, we can turn down, we can turn up, and we can continue to operate. Something like your lawn, it doesn't turn down and up very fast, and it can only go down maybe 200 megawatts of the 350. So when you look at a transitioning system, something like Mount Piper can perform the sort of role that Richard spoke about in terms of being available for a bit longer or being available for a bit shorter or running in seasons. It can do it really well, and we're operating and maintaining to deliver that function, because that's what we think is going to be needed. Something like Yallourn does not do that. Something like Yallourn has tens of thousands of tubes. Tubes are just pipes. And we have measured the thickness of every single tube in our boiler across 4 boilers, tens of thousands of pipes. And if you go and talk to our engineers, they'll give you this big A4 paper, and there's so many pipes, and they map every single pipe, and it's a colour-coded chart. And every red pipe is below a certain millimetre thickness, and every orange pipe is a better thickness, and every green pipe is one we've just replaced. We cannot replace all the pipes in all the boilers at Yallourn. Yallourn is a different kettle of fish to Mount Piper, and it is heading towards closure in 2028, which is what we have told and informed the market. And it's just very different technology to Mount Piper. So I guess where I'm going with that is there's coal and there's coal, and older coal is much more difficult to extend, particularly in that transitional peakier role, than newer coal. And looking at most of Australia's coal, we're lucky that there's more of it in the newer coal category than in the older coal category. But there are some plants like Yallourn which are in the older category, which if I'm sort of looking at them, I'm thinking their future is shorter, not longer.
And Jeff, what about you? Loy Yang B, obviously a real workhorse and still several decades of potential operating life ahead of it. How are you thinking about that asset in particular?
So over the last 5 or 6 years, Perry, I think we've been at 98.5% availability, which is by world standards outstanding. It's the youngest of the fleet in Victoria. There are a lot of lessons learnt by the SCCV when they built Loy Yang A that were put into Loy Yang B, and you'll see that in the performance of the asset. Right now, I had a look 5 minutes ago, the pool price is $0 in Victoria, $1 or something. Those units are running at less than half capacity. Tonight, when the sun goes down, they'll be at full capacity. And to Mark's point, I mean, just like they do at Mount Piper, we're maintaining that asset against that running regime as we move forward. We haven't at any point been persuaded to bring forward the closure date of Loy Yang B. Our view, when we look at the market, is that asset will be required for a long time to come. And certainly, I'm not saying this today, but we've been on the record that we felt that despite all of the great gains that we have made in decarbonising, that we were never on track to achieve the stated objectives that were put out. The lowest hanging fruit we've grabbed hold of. And it is interesting to listen to the narrative today. I think there's a sort of a shifting back, that an acknowledgement across the board now that we have to be more pragmatic. We shouldn't lower our aspiration, but we need to be realistic. And to Richard's point, we've got to have plan Bs and plan Cs along the way. And my view is I feel the market's moving more to a plan B now. And I think we're getting to a point that's more rational and sensible and deliverable from a total market perspective.
Yeah, great. That plan B, in your mind, does that see us hitting 82% renewables by 2030?
Look, it's great to have ambition. I think that's a real struggle. Let me focus. There's a lot of positives. It's easy to get negative, I guess, when change is coming, but there are a lot of positives out there. I mean, we've been absolutely amazed by the take-up of VPP, battery, solar, behind the meter. My view is that whilst in some areas things have been overestimated, this is one area where it's been underestimated. And I think households are going to do more of the heavy lifting, Perry, which will necessarily take some of the heat off of the utility scale developments that we're looking at. I would also say to that end, then maybe there's a challenge in how we're thinking and looking at transmission. And I'll give you an example. No one was forecasting the uptake that we're seeing at the residential level. And so do we need all of the transmission? Has someone gone back and reforecast based on load being generated at the source? should we be leaning into those investments?
Well, it's too late, isn't it? I mean, this transmission's...
Some of it, but not all of it. I think, the reality is if it's no longer the right decision, somebody needs to put their hand up and say, hey, stop. No one's going to thank the industry for over-capitalising on assets that are redundant into the future. And remembering, transmission's very different. We're all in the generation retail business. We face the blowtorch of competition. Transmission does not. It will be regulated on your bill for the next 25 years. So we need to be especially careful.
Yeah, Richard, what's your perspective on the transition, but particularly here in New South Wales? Obviously, we've got a lot of renewable energy zones being planned. All of them seem behind schedule. How do you sort of see that next phase developing over the next sort of 5 years?
I think New South Wales has got to heavily invest into that transition. I think we get very idealistic about what we should and shouldn't be building. We've actually got to build something. As much as I've talked about my power station could go to 36, 38, it needs replacing. And it needs replacing, and that planning process needs to be doing now. So arguing about what could be in the future replacing, it gets replaced now by a combination of some VPP projects, it gets replaced by some solar projects, it gets mainly replaced by wind, and it gets replaced by gas. I would say the transition in New South Wales lives or dies by Narrabri. If Narrabri is not developed in New South Wales, the transition's off. You're going to be relying on my coal-fired power station. Now, I say that, and it's sort of calling for my own death now, because I have no involvement in Narrabri, but that's the truth of it. Coal, we're trying to talk about the wrong thing. The transition isn't about producing energy. The actual challenge with transition is a store of energy. If you look at a lump of coal, it is a brilliant natural store of energy, except it's incredibly dirty. So being able to release that store of energy when customers need it is the critical component. That's why we're focused on batteries. Delta's looking at building a battery at site. But that ability to store energy is a crucial missing link in this transition. And that's why you need gas. It's absolutely crucial. On my coal stockpile, I've got more energy stored than every single battery in Australia. And I'm just one power station. And that's what we're trying to change. So trying to work out how you get that dense energy store replaced is absolutely critical. And the only solution to that, in the physics of what we're doing right now, is gas. So if we ain't doing Narrabri, we're not transitioning. And that's what the green groups have got to recognise. Probably for my economic success, the green groups are probably my biggest friend, because they're the biggest blocker on actually doing rational, sensible policy.
This is the Instagram warriors Malinauskas has been talking about.
Yeah, I don't tread in LinkedIn or any of those areas because it's just too... Everything's black and white. Everything's said with such great certainty. My world is incredibly grey, massively uncertainty, and that's what you've got to prepare for. That's what you've got to work to. That's what the politicians need to work to. Now, the politicians, Chris Minns and Peter Malinauskas today, have actually been very practical in what they're saying, but they're trying to do something incredibly difficult. And there seems to be a fear to admit that this is a really hard thing to do, and it will go wrong. That's absolutely guaranteed. Things will go wrong. So what is your plan B? What's your backup for when things go wrong? And you can't precisely say what will go wrong, but absolutely it will go wrong. Guaranteed.
Mark, I think Jeff last year talked about the need for an honest debate about the energy transition about 18 months ago. What's your perspective? Do you think we're having that debate now, particularly in terms of the costs that could come down the line to households and users?
Look, I think we're getting to a good level of debate. A couple of years ago, most of the industry would say things like, well, there will be wind droughts. And wind droughts will last for a week or two, and it means there'll be no wind. And if that happens during winter, there'll be high demand, low wind. When it's cloudy, there won't be much supply from solar, and so there needs a backup. It needs to be this gas backup. And by and large, a lot of the stakeholders in the sector would just say, oh, no, we'll be right. There's electric vehicles which will back up the grid. And most of the industry was like, yeah, it doesn't work that way. And it turned out not to work that way. And we saw 2 winters in a row that it doesn't work that way. And there's nothing like a bit of lived experience to bring the realism, the pragmatism to the sector. And that's come through in that the people in the grid who have to make it work, they know what they're talking about, and they're actually setting up to have a grid, as Daniel said earlier, Daniel Westerman, have a grid that works in all weather conditions. So then that's a good thing. It means that a general level of scepticism on all claims, whether they're extreme left or extreme right, is there. And there's a migration to the middle where things have to happen, but they have to happen in a way that works. The uncomfortable truth of all of that is there is an enormous wave of investment coming, and it doesn't really matter what your market structure is or what the wholesale price is in any given half hour. If tens of billions of dollars of investment go into the sector, it has to be paid for. However, it has to be paid for. And it either gets paid for by rising customer bills, government balance sheets, or some other mechanism where customers choose to install their own sector. In that context, I think where the debate is going is, well, how do you do that as cheaply as possible? And one way you do that as cheaply as possible is if customers want to do some themselves, let them at it. So the battery rebates and the solar rebates, they have been a source of real driver of change that customers want to fund, and let them at it. And even better, the virtual power plants where those sectors work, where those batteries work with the rest of the sector to bring costs down, great. And then more broadly, I think the question that all the industry is working through is, well, what are the cheapest next pieces? And one of the things that seems to be emerging is that wind costs are going up, solar and battery costs are going down. A whole lot of the sector was planned on do a whole lot of wind, but it now looks like that is really expensive compared to over here. So the debate I think that's coming is, well, what are the cheapest bits and how do we do more of those? And I think that's a good debate.
Yeah, Jeff, you've been pretty vocal the last couple of years around energy prices and the potential sort of shock coming for households. Where do you sit on that now? And do you think that message is getting through?
Well, I'd start off by saying, unfortunately, I was right. But I think we're getting to a more moderate point now, and it's refreshing to hear, I guess, our political leaders being open that it is going to cost more. It is. There's no doubt that putting in new renewables is cheaper than putting in alternate forms of energy. But we must remember, and I think part of the discussion that got lost was we were replacing, and we are replacing and will continue to replace for some time, written down assets with lower marginal cost. Yes, we get a lower marginal cost with renewables, but we get a much higher capital cost, which Mark just covered. So where does that sort of level us out? I do think that prices will go up a little bit from here, but if you wind the clock back a few years ago, I rang the bell, we're looking at 20, 30% increases. I don't view that moving forward to be the case. I'll put a caveat, depends on how much we're going to spend on transmission, but certainly in the generation and retail part, I see prices largely moderating.
But having said that, if all the current transmission plans go ahead, we could see some sort of...
We will see a distinct shift on the bill where a much higher percentage of your energy bill will relate to network charges than we've seen historically. And I guess, here's the political challenge, right? You're encouraging the homeowners to invest in things like solar and battery. I'll give you an example. Certainly the VPP program that we're running, we've seen household consumption go from circa 8 megawatt hours down to 1 megawatt hour. And so I'll tell you what's going to be really interesting is what if someone tries to rebalance transmission charges and says, rather than a throughput charge, you're now getting a fixed charge. So all the benefit you've made going from 8 to 1, you're going to get that bill back. I think that's going to create a lot of uproar and going to put a lot of pressure on politicians. So this is what I'm saying about we've got to go back and review. A lot of the plans that were not made with the expectation of the outcomes we're seeing. And it needs to be an iterative process. We need to keep reviewing, okay, things haven't taken the path that we thought they'd take. As Richard said, that's inevitable. But let's not have an old plan. We can't be static. We've got to be dynamic with this stuff. Otherwise, we're going to have unintended consequences. And another one of that nature will be if a lot of residentials come off using throughput on those transmission and distribution systems, what's going to happen to industry? Are we going to see? Are there cross-subsidy issues that are emerging that are going to get worse? And we've got to remain competitive. So again, what's the lens being cast over that in a whole of system plan. They're some of the bigger challenges that we see coming.
Yeah, great. I know I've only got a couple of minutes left. I do want to try and get a question in from the audience as well, but I just wanted to ask you all about the 2035 emissions reduction target announced last week. Fairly broad range, 62 to 70%. You're sort of right at the coalface, of things. How difficult is it to hit even that 62% target? Maybe starting with you, Richard.
It's incredibly difficult, but that's not to say the target shouldn't be set. I mean, we need to replace our assets. We need to be building things. We need to set targets. It's just incredibly difficult. And if you recognise it's incredibly difficult, you prepare for it. The thing about the energy cost is, going to Jeff's point, my asset's been written down. All the assets here being written down. Consequently, that's actually quite cheap, but they need replacing. So the power prices will go up. That's inevitable. But it'll go up further if we don't plan properly and don't recognise it's going to be a very difficult transition. Because if we don't do that, we will make even more mistakes and the cost will be even higher. And that'll be deadly for Australia.
Well, what about you, Mark? What's your perspective on the 2035 targets?
There's a lot to be done. In many ways, electricity is the easy bit, because you can look at electricity and say, well, I have the technology. I can see I've got wind, I've got solar, I've got batteries, I've got gas as a backup. I can stitch this together and make a system that works at very high levels of renewables. And that's a precondition for the broader economic and environmental transformation. The other sectors, it's not that clear that there are actually technology solutions, whether it's green steel or green iron or other technologies of that nature. You definitely need the electricity, and that bit's hard, but I'd argue doable with good planning and picking up the points that have been discussed today. The bigger question for me is just what it means for industry and whether there's enough oomph in the system to drive those newer technologies through, or on the flip side, enough commitment to things like gas, which might not get you to the end state, but actually get you a material reduction in the emissions profile.
And Jeff?
Look, the guys have summed it up really well. I think the big challenge is outside of energy, to Mark's point. Our industry is doing its bit, it's doing a lot of the heavy lifting, but we just can't get there unless other sectors pull their weight. And, I would again agree with Richard. I think it's a good thing to have ambition, but we shouldn't get ourselves so steadfastly set on we're going to get there. Let's plan for, maybe we can overshoot it. That would be great. We can celebrate that. But what do we do if we go off the rails? What are the plan Bs and plan Cs?
Yeah, excellent. Well, unfortunately, we have hit our time. So, Mark Collette, Jeff Dimery and Richard Wrightson, thanks very much for joining us.